uh, uh, I'm digressing a little bit, but the reason why I stopped making art and I studied literature is because we were talking before. Um, I found when I went to school, when I studied art in school, in university, I studied in a university, so it wasn't an art school. I didn't just study art, but in the art classes that I took, like I told you, I didn't really have a technical schooling. I didn't really learn. I mean, I could if I wanted to, but I didn't have to learn how to paint or how to sculpt. It was more theory about what art is, how to think about art, how to.
The same thing that we are talking about, linguistics and anthropology.
Yeah,
I
it's and as yeah and the as if the idea being that it's almost like you think of something completely, not just what you're going to make, but how people are going to read it, how it's going to be received, where it's going to sit in the history of art, whatever the history of art is, and then you make it, and then it should be that way. And if it isn't that way, then you made a mistake.
Yeah.
And and when I started taking classes in other disciplines like philosophy and literature, and I found that actually even in the world of theory, it's not that way. The theory classes I had in art school, you would have, for example, whatever, Foucault or whatever, and the teacher would say, well, he said X, Y, and Z, and that's Foucault. And when I took a class that talked about Foucault in another department, in the literature department, the professor would say, well, this is what I think he's saying, but I'm not sure. Let's look at it again. And then we would look, and then we would talk about it and discuss and actually really enter into the text. And there's something about that intimacy of entering into a contact with something for a long time, until you lose a sense of where you are, what you think, and then you start to find another way, and then you start to question until you start to find a way to navigate, but that's close to what you're looking at. Anyway, that's something that I find is really missing in art, because I think I'm not to say that it doesn't exist. I think it exists. Someone who's a painter, or someone who has a very concrete practice, whether it's painting, photography, or even something more conceptual, but someone who's really working with something, you have that interaction. But the way that people talk about art, the way that people look at art, is very much like the passage in Roy Wagner. It's self-conscious to the point that it's just about control, and actually I find that even in many cases, of course not everyone, because there are great artists even today. There are great artists today, but there are, and who are doing things differently and in a great way. But many artists many works that I encounter, even when they're encountering a real life situation, like something like this, that notion of control is still present. In a way, I feel like many artists that I know, even, they would enter a situation like this one, they would already know what they wanted to make before coming, and then they would come here just to make it, and then they would leave, and that's it. That would be the end. And so anyway, that's a long introduction. But when I came to Brazil in 2012, I didn't really know anything about anthropology or indigenous cultures, and wasn't really something that I thought about, except that I really loved Triste Tropique, but that was it. I just thought it was a beautiful book, and and then I read something about the Piraha, I read something about their language and Everett, and I thought it was interesting just because I was interested in language. And I couldn't understand what Everett was saying because it didn't make sense. But at the same time, I wanted to know more. So I came, and then I actually met Everett before, Daniel Everett, before I came to Brazil. He told me to talk to José Livigno and Marco. I met José Livigno briefly, I met Marco, and then I just started having a conversation with Marco, and then with Els, and we just started to become friends, really. And I couldn't really read Marco's text because I didn't know Portuguese. I started learning Portuguese during the residency. I started reading some of Elsa's texts actually first. One text by Marco in English. And then I started meeting other people. I met Bruna, I met this guy Tommaso who was studying with her.
That's a musician.
Yeah. And then I just became, and then through the person who does this residency, Helmut, this residency Capacete in Rio, I met Pedro Cesarini, and I met Manuela Canela da Cunha. And then, but each just once. Oh, Pedro I met 2 or 3 times. And then I became obsessed or fascinated by what I was hearing, because I know I have an experience of being a graduate PhD student, but for me that experience is going to a library and looking at books. And books, you look at them and then you leave them behind or you take them at home, but they're going to stay the same. But then I was meeting people whose doctoral research was coming to a situation like this.
Yeah.
And for example, what Marco described to me of the Piraha was arriving in a place without really knowing the language, without knowing anything, meeting Everett, who was kind of nice and kind of secretive, and then spending 3 months and then coming back and spending 3 months, and then the way that they were talking about their work, it was so much more interesting to me than what I was seeing around me in art, because it was really, you see many things in art that talk about making something about people who different cultures or cultural differences or real life situations or socioeconomic problems or whatever, is everything okay with it? Yeah. Whatever the thing is, but it's always, again, from starting with a ready-made idea of whatever that is and then confirming it. Even in the residency that I was doing in Rio, during that time when I met Marco, there were 4 other artists. 3 of them were doing projects about Brazil, and one was doing a project about urbanization, one was doing a project on I don't know what. One had done a project on I think favelas. I met another artist who had done another project on favelas, but they already knew what they thought it was, and they had already read, they went to film, to do what they wanted to film from what they read in Holland or in Belgium or whatever, without going. And all of a sudden I was meeting people who would first go, meet, live, and then start to think about what they could maybe start to think about, if that makes sense.
Another thing that anthropologists like Viveros de Castro explicitly said about equivocation.
Yes.
We are always aware that you can understand, but it can be equivocation, and
yes.
this is productive and creative.
Yes.
To take your equivocation about the other,
mm-hmm.
and then you realize that the member's meaning is other thing.
Yes.
That is a kind of effect of surprise.
Yes.
Kind of.
It's an event.
Yeah.
It's a, yeah, it has a, yes, it's like what I was saying with the image of this religious ceremony today, that I was looking at my camera. I was looking at the image, I was trying to think about the image, but everything that I thought about the image made me think of how I was thinking about the image first. Because it's the third time for me in this kind of situation. I know that I have to slow down and, you know, think a bit, question myself a bit more. And so anyway, I started so my residency was for 3 months. I stayed, I think, 3.5 months. At the end of my stay, Marco said, well, maybe, you know, if you're really interested, you should come with me. And I said, well, I don't know what I would make. And he said, but that's actually okay. You should not come with an idea of what you should make.
Yeah.
If you're interested, you should just go. And then that's how I went. I didn't know what I was going to do when I went. And so I thought, I said, sure. But at that point it was a complete dream. There had no basis. But we kept talking, I kept wanting to, and then it took almost 4 years to organize, because Marco was away 1 year, I couldn't go another year. And then finally we went in 2016. In between, I went with you to the Machakali in 2015. And then what was interesting to me was that the more I talked about these projects with people around me in the art world, everyone I met had a different reason for why I shouldn't do it. Some people said, oh, you're just going because it's this romantic idea of a primitive people that live happily. Other people were saying, oh, you shouldn't go because you're a white guy going to an indigenous group, what are you going to do, and then you're going to sell the work and make money, and blah, blah, blah. And other people were saying, but why are you going to do this? It has nothing to do with your work. And then I remember one friend said, you know, but why are you doing this? This has nothing to do with the kind of art that you like, because the only thing you can do with this is do something like a documentary film. And what's interesting about a documentary film? And then I thought, you know, we had a very strange discussion, because I said, but I asked him, don't you think that it's strange that you think that I shouldn't do something with a real life situation? And he said, no, but a real life situation, that's realism. I was like, no, but realism is a thing in literature that means something else. He's like, yeah, but it's not art. I said, but then what does that mean? He's like, no, art is more about like the ideas, it's more about the kind of art that you and I like is conceptual art, it's more about theory, it's more about ideas, it's more about this, it's more about thinking about the form. You're not going to just take an image or something, you should think about the... And then we had this very strange discussion, and I thought, but actually, all the reasons that he's giving me for not doing it make me think that maybe it's the most important thing that I could do.
Yeah.
It's in a way more radical than to make a work about, you know, what is a photograph or whatever he wanted me to do.
Yeah.
And then but then actually the truth is I still didn't know what I was going to do. I still didn't know if I could make a work. There's still moments today where I'm not sure, but then I'm pretty sure now. But I really just was passionate about what I was encountering, and I was learning Portuguese more and more. I was reading more and more texts in anthropology. I was talking more and more with the people I'd met, and everything that I encountered in those moments made me want to go farther. And so I just kept going because I wanted to, and because I couldn't stop myself from doing it. And then when I went to the Piraha the first time, it was a very intense experience, and I filmed. I was kind of learning how to film as I was filming, like with the Mashakahi. And then I came back and I tried to look at the images, and for 5 months I couldn't really look at the images because every time I looked at them, I was like, wow, I don't know. The images are too sharp. They're too rich. I don't know what to do with them. And then, but then we were organizing a second trip, so we went a second time. And then when I went a second time, something changed, and I started to understand something about filming. And I started to understand how I could film with the piraha, which is different from how I'm filming here, because I would just set up the camera, I would show them, if they were interested, I would show them. Sometimes they really didn't care, but sometimes they wanted to see, or I would ask them always, and then I would show them, and then I would just leave the camera, and then life would kind of organize around the camera. And so most of the filming I did, especially in the second trip, but a little bit in the first trip, is very passive, and the camera is actually never really close. It's always, I always start from a distance, and sometimes they move closer to the camera, but I never move closer to them, or very rarely. And then I started to see something about what I was filming, and also I kept talking with Marco, and I started to understand more. And in truth, I'm not really answering your question because I still don't know how it relates to my work, because it's very different. If I look at if I look at what I filmed with the piraha or what I filmed today, if I think about what I'm going to show because I'm going to show something of the piraha in October, and I think about it in relation to my work, it seems very different. And in other ways, it's close. I think it's close because the questions that I have are the same about, not the same, but I'm coming back to certain questions I had in my other work, questions about language, questions about difference.
And you said that when you read Labov,
Yeah.
that you interested more and more about
Yes.
language.
Yes, and yeah, that's her. That's her. No, because that's what's. I was always interested in language and languages, but when I was telling you, I read something about Labov, and then I read Labov himself, and what was really interesting is he speaks of a kind of creativity within language, because he says that languages are always changing and they're always differentiating. If one group of people moves away from another group of people, whether geographically, or because they're poorer or richer, or because they're electricians or farmers, then there will be like an English of farmers and an English of electricians and an English of rich people and English of poor people, or and that to me was really interesting because it's a creativity that doesn't have an author, that's not tied, and I think that's a big problem in art, because everything comes back to a kind of individual author, an individual owner also of a work, of an image, or of an idea. And what I find beautiful in language is that it's incredibly creative, or creative in the sense that it keeps producing, inventing new things.
Impersonal creativity.
But it's an impersonal creativity. And so, yeah, so I think that's one thing with the piraha. And the other thing is that this, you're looking for Nikki.
Tem alguém rosnando? Uma onça? Um cachorro?
Quem é?
Não sei.
Vocês querem ver?
Vamos lá. Deixa eu parar aqui.